Hen, JannisZ, and Chapix have won the FNCS Championship and in an amazing style, clearly being the most dominant team in this season by a long shot across pretty much every game mode. But where did it start? At the end of Chapter 2 Season 2's FNCS, which seems like a long time ago now, JannisZ actually ended up placing second. He was teaming at the time with X-Squeeze and Andalex, and they were all speaking English, which definitely isn't Andalex's preferred language. Throughout the entire finals, there was a 2-day event back then. They were battling out between Mongrel, Mitro, and Tayson. And if you remember, it went down absolutely to the last wire. And I actually covered this in my most recent video, but it's still relevant because now we're talking about JannisZ. So they ended up coming second, but that team split because I've kind of hinted to this already. Andalex and X-Squeeze don't necessarily like speaking English as their preferred language because they are a French team, so they decided to pick up Snazy instead. Hen ended up placing 9th and Chapix ended up placing 30th. The first time this season that any of these teams played together was actually in a tournament that you wouldn't necessarily expect, as it was the Super Cup. Chapix and Hen played together through the Opens and the Finals and actually ended up placing second. It was a Marvel tournament, remember, which had a lot of the mythic items from the Marvel introduced at that time. And they're performing extremely well towards the end of that season together, like I said, placing second. There is no structured plan for these guys to play together coming towards into really any other tournament apart from this fun one at this point. But after Chapix ended up being dropped by Tayson mid-tournament, he ended up playing with Hen for the DreamHack that weekend. And in January 22nd, which was the NA East DreamHack, they ended up playing together yet again. And remember, Chapix was on 130 ping, and Hen being on average 100. They ended up placing first across regions. This, yes, is just an Opens. However, in the finals of this, they actually ended up placing 13th. So really good, and clearly this team were performing as a duo. Then next week was EU, where they ended up placing 4th. So these guys clearly had a huge amount of potential playing together. However, looking through the tournaments from February, there was no real plan for these guys to stick together. DreamHack was over. They decided to play together for the next Trio Cash Cup, where they ended up picking up X8, which they took a nice 7th place slot, so performing very well. However, outside of these two already kind of structuring themselves as a trio, there was no real intent to put JannisZ in, publicly at least at this point. Now, unfortunately, JannisZ tweeted towards the end of January that his father had passed, which was extremely sad to read. Me personally, as I have lost my father at a young age, this definitely hit home for me and I could definitely feel the pain, so all the commemorances go to JannisZ. But he also made a tweet saying how he's going to grind so much harder because his dad was his biggest supporter, which again was very heartfelt for me because I could clearly put myself in his shoes at this point. Their first Cash Cup playing together, they placed second. And then, right after that, they placed 8th on NA East, clearly showing that this trio of JannisZ, Chapix, and Hen had a huge amount of potential. At the end of that week was the first qualifiers for the FNCS, where they placed first in the round 4, completely dominating the entire lobby, and it looked like these guys were absolutely the strongest team coming into this season. Now, because they couldn't play qualifier 2 or 3 since they had already made it through to the semifinals, we could only really see what they did in their Cash Cups at that point. But what they did in their Cash Cups was no short of amazing. They placed first, then first again, and then 5th. So if you think at this point, on the EU region, the lowest they have placed coming in is 5th. So an absolutely incredible performance from this team, showing how consistent they are at getting in those top place slots. In their heat, they had potentially one of the hardest heats in the semifinals, but still ended up placing 3rd, an extremely consistent performance. So coming into the finals, I'd set my predictions high, and you can see on screen exactly what they were. In the first place slot, most importantly, Hen, JannisZ, and Chapix, because they thought, honestly, based on the performances that they've had so far, they just looked more consistent and stronger than any other team coming into the FNCS finals. There were a lot of other great teams like Flick, Anas, and Thomas HD. However, these guys have really popped off in their heat. You know, they got a 26 elimination game and it ended up placing second in that particular game with 2 victory royales, really dominated their heat. However, they just have not been as consistent as JannisZ, Hen, and Chapix, so I didn't want to put them at the top of my predictions. Their general game plan throughout all of these has been relatively similar. They land at Craggy Cliffs and end up looting all of the shield barrels very quickly, loot this entire POI, and get out of there. During their Cash Cups, they'd also taken some of the green steel bridge down to the south of this, and some of the loot around that area to get Storm Surge tags on the team in Pleasant Park. But in the finals and later on in the FNCS, they didn't really end up doing this because it created too much of a large split. Their strengths, absolutely and hands down, were always their ability to pick up eliminations. They were always picking up eliminations in the early and mid game, and anytime you look at this team throughout the entire FNCS, they always had at least 3 eliminations going into that moving zone. This season, a lot of teams really struggled with Storm Surge because there was very high thresholds, and teams had just generally avoided being hit by damage due to the fact that teams at this point have caught on to Storm Surge, how to get tags and how to avoid being tagged. This team had no issues with this because they were always able to get those early and mid-game eliminations by just picking a really good fight on the team, usually also fighting for a good position on the zone at the same time. Once they had this nothing to worry about Storm Surge, they nearly always had good loot as well because of their uncontested drop spot and the fact that they picked up the refreshes on those eliminations. The endgame just seemed like it was not an issue for these guys at all after being set up so well beforehand. They ended the first day, which was 6 games on day 1, with 137 points, 10 points behind first place, and they were currently in 3rd. So very close and very tight-knit up to the top. Remember, the finals format for the FNCS was 2 days, where there was 6 games on day 1 and 6 games on day 2 as well. So coming into this 7th game, which was day 2, game 1, they were already in that 3rd slot. They started off with a massive 3rd with 5 eliminations. If you know anything about the FNCS format, once you hit that top 3, that's when the big placement points kick in. So a very good game for them there. However, next game is where they really started to cement their lead. Game 2 of day 2, they picked up a victory royale with 8 eliminations and put on an absolute show while they did it. This is the first time this day that they'd been on top of the leaderboards, and they're starting to look very promising for the team. However, the issue arose in the next 2 games. They really struggled with their ability to get into the moving zones in their early and mid-game strategy that they'd employed so well throughout the last few games. So they ended up picking up an 11th and then a 17th, only grabbing a single placement point after that game. So with 2 games remaining, they were no longer the kings of the leaderboard on that first place slot. Vidil, Norali and Rezon had actually popped off with a victory royale and a 2nd place and a 5th place game in the first 4, with a bunch of eliminations in their classic manner, in these guys being an absolutely incredible team. They'd overtaken Hen, JannisZ and Chapix by 12 points with 2 games remaining. Not only that, Andalek, Snazy and X-Squeeze had climbed up the leaderboard as well to only be around 20 points behind them. So the race for the top 3 going into the last 2 games was absolutely nail-biting. However, a shakeup arises in the leaderboards. In the second to last game of the day, Vidil, Norali and Rezon end up being eliminated in 13th just during that first moving zone. At this point, Hen, JannisZ and Chapix pick up a 7 elimination game and end up in 4th place, making them up to the 1st place slot on the leaderboards. However, at this time, that game was won by Flick, Anas and Thomas HD, who had 16 eliminations, which was the most we'd seen across the finals by a long shot. This put them into 3rd place and in contention for that 1st place slot. Going into the final game, the top 3 teams were only separated by 12 points, so it really could go any way, and what a final game this was. The game started off with the German team of Norali, Rezon and Vidil picking up 2 big eliminations, which gained them, yes, 4 points, moving them up closer to Hen, JannisZ and Chapix. However, for this team, tragedy struck because Norali's game crashed, meaning that it was left as a duo. Later on in this game, we saw Rezon and Vidil rotate into Hen, JannisZ and Chapix in a 2v3 fight. However, both teams are absolutely top class fighters, and it didn't look like either team was really losing, to be honest. As a duo, Vidil, Norali and Rezon were holding their own. Sancho West on the mic made an absolutely fantastic call, calling this the $100,000 fight, because these 2 teams were battling for top first, which each prize was $100,000. Seemed to be going okay. However, Flecken, a 3rd party, came in with a sniper shot and hit what I would like to call the $100,000 snipe onto Rezon, unfortunately turning the tables for this team, which allowed Hen, JannisZ and Chapix to pretty easily pick up Vidil, meaning they were out of contention for the 1st place slot. However, Flick, Anas and Thomas HD were still in the game. Going into moving zones, Flick picked up an amazing 3 eliminations at the back of first moving to secure them 6 points, but on top of that, loot to keep them moving through the zones. It was extremely tense as the games were going on, and both teams were actually performing very well into the moving zones. It ended up being a steamy stacks moving zones, which was incredibly awkward, and overall, let's just see how it ended up playing out.
Go, run, go, run, go, go, go. Good fight. Dead!
One speed,
Dead!
Nice! 2v2, 2v2, 2v3, 2v3.
Guys, 2v2.
It's station! I think we won!
Going up. I'm cranking. I fight!
No, watch it.
Dead! Let's go!
Not only did Hen, JannisZ and Chapix pick up the FNCS Championship, they were clearly the best team of the season. And not only that, they did it in incredible style. The reason I mentioned JannisZ's dad unfortunately passing earlier, because he made his tweet saying that he was going to do everything he could for his father. And to see him pick up the first place slot and be so happy and so proud, and to say that he did it for his dad, means absolutely everything to me, as I already mentioned, as a guy who's lost his dad already. So honestly, this Champions title could not have gone to a more deserving team, and a huge applause to them.